Well, many of you may be wondering, who is this guy? Well, my name is John Lester, and I wanted to take this opportunity today to share with you a little bit about myself, about the testimony that God has given me. Um, Not sure how many of you grew up, but for me, myself, I didn't have the beaver cleaver childhood. I never remember my parents being together. Never remember that happy moment where Mom and Dad were sitting down there waiting when I got up Christmas morning to open my gifts, or Mom and Dad throw a birthday party for me. Um, Never remember things like that. First memory I have of my parents together are sitting in the middle of a courthouse when I was probably about 4 years old and seeing the two of them fight over me. Well, by the time I was 5 years old, I was living with my father in Portsmouth, Virginia, and I remember my dad asking me, he said, would you and your sister like to go see your grandparents that live in Danville? And I'm like, sure, that'd be awesome. You know, 5-year-olds, we love to see our grandparents because we know at that moment we're going to get spoiled. You can definitely dip your hand in the cookie jar, so to speak. So my dad dropped me off on a Friday, my sister and I, and said, you know, I'll be back Sunday morning to pick you up. Well, little did I know that that Sunday morning would never come again for 6 years. My dad left me with my grandparents, and I lived with both of them for some time in Danville, Virginia. And as I lived with them, my grandparents' health started to go downhill, and my mom lived here in Danville and really didn't know her too well, but was pretty much forced to have to go live with her. So moved in with my mom, my sister, and I, and my grandparents both passed away, and after my mom inherited some money, we moved down to a little house in Danville right off North Main Street. And as we lived there, my whole life began to change even more for the worse. My mom began to take the money that she had, and she didn't use it for taking care of my sister and I. And by the time I was 7 years old, we were many times living with no power, no food. Remember getting high with my mom smoking marijuana when I was 7, 8 years old with her and her friends. By the time I was probably about 9 years old, I was taken and placed in a foster home. Lived in Chatham, Virginia, and moved in with an awesome family. They really cared about us and took care of us, and for the first time in my life, I'd experienced love. It was the first time I had two people that were a mother and a father that were there for me, and they cared for me. And so I lived with them for 2 years. In those 2 years, my life totally changed. I gave my life to the Lord, and I was baptized, and lo and behold, a couple years after living with them, I would find out that I would be sent back to live with my father in Suffolk, Virginia. I moved back to Suffolk, and my father, he had remarried, and first got there, it seemed as though life would be pretty good, but lo and behold, it was a vicious cycle that repeated itself. And my father separated from his new wife, and slowly things began to go downhill. We moved on to a farm on Kings Fork Road and lived there for several years in a small trailer. After that, I was moved again to Portsmouth with my dad, where he bought a little house, and we lived there for some time. My whole life, I never remember living in one place too long. It was always living from pretty much pillar to post, as I would describe it. By the time I was 15 years old, I had quit school in the 8th grade. I'd done a lot of things that I wasn't proud of. I'd been in a lot of trouble, been in a lot of fights. And as I look back through my life and I would hear people share with me about God and tell me about God, I just couldn't imagine a God that really loved me. You know, I couldn't imagine a God that supposedly cared so much about me but would allow me to go through so many circumstances in my life. And so when I was 15 years old, I was an 8th grade dropout. I moved to Virginia Beach. I lived with some cousins of mine. They were great people and still are. But When I got there, I began to drink. I began to party. Got a job down on the ocean front, Virginia Beach. 15-year-old kid, you feel like life, how could it be any better? Began to drink, party, girls, get high. Life was good. I did this for 3 years as I lived with him. When I was 18 years old, I moved back in with my father in Portsmouth, Virginia, and I was working at a sub shop, and one night had a friend of mine come by that I'd gone to school with back in middle school, and he told me, he said, "Hey man," he said, "we're going to have a party tomorrow night." He said, "You want to come out?" And I'm like, "Sure, a party, the opportunity to get drunk, get high, who doesn't want to do that?" Well, the next night as I showed up at the party, everybody was doing just as I expected. Everybody was getting high and everybody was drinking. My friend walked over to the nightstand and he picked up a little pistol that he had and he started to play with it. And I remember telling him, "Hey man, just give me that gun." And he wouldn't give it to me, and he sat down in front of myself and my other friends, and he got on his knees. And if you knew this fella, he was always a jokester, and so you never really knew what to expect. Well, he started playing with it, and somehow or another a bullet got jammed in the chamber, and he dropped a clip out of it and unjammed it. And next thing I know, I hear a gunshot go off, and as I look down, I see blood running to my feet. And he had taken that pistol, and I don't know whether he knew it was loaded or whether he didn't, but that night I watched a friend of mine take his own life. It was a pretty rough night. Didn't know what I would do from there or where I would go. I'd seen a lot. I'd done a lot. 4 months later, I'd found out I'd be a father. You wonder, how in the world are you going to take care of a kid? How in the world are you going to be a father? You've never been shown to be a father. You've never been taken care of. You've never had an example. I remember going to my dad, and he was at work, and I told him, I said, "Look, Renee is pregnant, and I don't know what to do." I remember him telling me, he said, "Well, son," he said, you don't have to marry her. People don't do that no more." And I said, "Well, Dad, I'm not doing that. That's not an option for me." I said, "I'm going to marry her, and I'm going to take care of the responsibility that I helped to make." And so a few days later, her and I got married. Been married now for 19 years. My son just turned 18 and just graduated from high school. Pretty good kid. Well, it wouldn't be long after that before I would find out I wasn't the perfect husband. I wasn't the perfect father. I never had that example. I really didn't know how to be that perfect dad, that perfect father, or the perfect husband. But I remember working at Lowe's in Suffolk, Virginia, and I had a friend there that, man, he would just worry me to death. I had seen this friend of mine named Bobby, and he was one of these guys that would party and he would carry on. Well, all of a sudden he come into work one day and he had his hair cut, and he was the kind of guy, he'd come into work sometimes with this long hair, and somebody beat and grabbed a hold to him at a party the night before and just pummeled him. And I remember him coming in and his hair was cut, and all he wanted to do was talk to me about Jesus. And he would share with me about how Jesus had changed his life. And I would laugh at him, and I would literally cuss him, and I would mock him, and I'd make fun of him, and I would persecute him. Well, one day I was in the back of Lowe's, and sitting on the back of a forklift was a little Gideon's Bible, brand new. Well, I picked that Bible up. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that Bobby had laid that Bible on there. And I went out in the yard and I looked for him, and I grabbed him, and I'm like, "Man, I know you left this Bible on there. I know it was you. You think you're funny, don't you?" And he swore to me he didn't do it. And still to this day he swears he didn't do it. Well, I remember taking that Bible and putting it in my pocket, and nobody knew, but I'd go into the bathroom and I'd read it. I wouldn't tell nobody I'd read it. And slowly I'd start asking him questions. But when people were around, I had to put up that image. I had to be the tough guy. I had to be the guy that everybody knew that mocked Bobby Long and persecuted him and judged him because of his relationship with Jesus. But I'd always tell him, I don't know this love that you're talking about. So one night I called him on the telephone, and I'm like, Bobby, I said, my wife's gone to a little church down the road, Southside Baptist Church in Suffolk, Virginia. I said, would you mind going with me? And Bobby, if you know him, he's kind of what comes up comes out. And he says, man, I almost fell off the toilet when you told me that. And I'm, Bobby, come on, buddy, I don't need to picture that. And he said, yeah, I'll go with you. Bobby went with me that night, and I was kind of curious, so I started going back. And I remember telling my wife, well, we're going back tonight. And she said, really? I'm like, yeah. Wednesday came around, and I said, don't they have church again? And she said, yeah. I said, we're going back again. Well, it would come on a Sunday night in December of 1997. I went to Southside for many years, and that night, something changed. I remember Pastor Stewart having an altar call on a Sunday night. He said, if there's anyone here that wants to accept Christ, come forward. That night, I came forward and accepted Christ as my Savior. That very night, I knew that God had a plan for me. I knew that He wanted to do something with my life. But I didn't know what it was. I didn't know His love. I didn't understand how He could love me yet. Well, that night, I gave my life to the Lord. I would start taking different Bible classes at church. Very first one I ever took was Evangelism Explosion. I learned how to witness to people. And the whole time I was going through it, I kept saying to myself, I'll never learn it. I can never do it. Well, in 1998, I went on a mission trip to the Eastern Shore and started working with the youth over there and just loved it. Then in 1997, I wasn't sure whether I would go back again. And I remember that night, it was on a Sunday night, and a friend of mine from church called me, and he said, John, he said, if you'll go on that mission trip this year, he said, everything's paid for. And I said, well, I just really don't plan on going. I said, I can't take off work and I can't afford it. And he said, John, I just said everything will be paid for. And I said, well, look, I'm going to pray about this. I said, if it's God's will, I'll go. Well, the next morning I got up, went to work just like normal, everything else. Well, I went by my mother-in-law's house to pick my son up that afternoon. And lo and behold, she said, you got a letter in the mail. I'm like, okay, well, I wonder why somebody didn't send it to my house. Why'd they send it here? I opened it up. And it was a friend of mine by the name of Phil who had written me this letter of encouragement. He said, John, you need to do what God's called you to do. He's called you to do it for a purpose. That next day, I got up and I called that guy back and I said, you know what? I'm going on that mission trip. I went on that mission trip not knowing how God would impact the rest of my life. See, growing up, I'd been kind of racist. I'd always used the N-word and really disrespected people that weren't like me. Well, that year, I went on that mission trip and I met a young black boy, 13 years old, by the name of Deontay. I got to know him for the next 2 or 3 days, and I had to leave early and come back off that mission trip because my son was going to have surgery that Friday. Well, that Thursday, as I showed up to teach the youth, Deontay didn't show up. So I went to his house, and he lived in a rundown trailer with roof caving in, and most of the houses around there looked like something in a third world country. As I met him that day, he had been beat up by his brothers and by some friends. So I went to his mom, whom I'd only known for maybe 45 minutes that whole week, and I asked her, I said, would you allow Deontay to come back to my house and stay with me? That very day, that very moment, she signed him over to me. That 13-year-old boy came to live in my house until he graduated from high school when he was 18. Today he's a cop. He's graduated from VMI, and we're proud to call him our son. Well, after he came to live with me, if you remember back in the beginning, I said I was an 8th grade dropout. I went back to high school and finished my high school diploma. In 2005, I enrolled at Liberty University, where I went there and I studied to get my undergraduate's degree. After that, I signed up and finished my master's degree through Liberty University. This isn't a story about me. It's not a story about my success. It's a story about how God used someone who had always been told he'd be nobody, who'd always been told that he would be a failure. Today, I'm a senior pastor. God has entrusted me at a church. I love the people. I love being used by God. I had one experience in my life where I remember feeling God more than I'd ever felt Him before. In 2008, I'd put an Xbox on Craigslist for sale. I met 2 young fellas at ODU one night as I walked up to what was supposed to be this young man's dorm room, his apartment. His friend came out from behind another door and put a .45 to the back of my head and told me that if I didn't get on the ground and do as he said, that he was going to take my life. At that very moment when it happened, my son and my wife were sitting in the van downstairs. I thought that I was going to die. I laid on the ground and I gave him everything, and I prayed out loud. And as I prayed out loud and prayed to God, it was as though a peace came over me. I knew that regardless of what happened at that very moment, that God had already preordained it. I knew that everything was going to be fine. I can't explain it. It's probably the most peace I've ever had in my life about anything. I don't know if my story reaches you. I don't know if you'll ever get anything out of it. But what I can tell you is this. I was that guy that no one expected to make it. My father used to tell me that I'd be in jail. And he was right. I was so close so many times because of the things that I'd done, the choices that I'd made. But it wasn't until I met a man named Jesus that my life changed. Friends, in John 3:16 it tells us that for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever would believe in Him would not perish but have everlasting life. I believe that with all my heart. In Romans 3:23 it tells us that we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Friends, every one of us, none of us are perfect. Romans also tells us in Romans 6:23 that the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life. In Ephesians 2:8 and 9 it tells us, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith, that not of yourselves but a gift of God, lest no man should boast. Friends, this isn't a story about me. It's not a story about pity, but it's a story about a man who met his Father, Jesus Christ. Maybe you're going through something today. Maybe you have a heavy heart. Maybe you've been told all your life you'll never be anybody. Maybe you've been told you'd be a failure. And perhaps because of what people have told you, you've lived up to what they've said. Friends, that doesn't have to be you. Give your life to God. Give your life to Jesus. I tried everything else. But the only thing that's ever worked is Jesus Christ.